A fractured life. The sharp hum of Matthew Carter's office phone cut through the ambient buzz of the city far below. He ignored it, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, hands clasped behind his back. The view, a kaleidoscope of lights from towering skyscrapers, was the kind of sight most people would kill to have. Yet, as Matthew gazed out, he felt a void deep in his chest, a chasm that even his billions couldn't fill. Matthew was the picture of power and prestige. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his tailored suit hung flawlessly from his broad shoulders, and his steel-blue eyes could make the most seasoned executives falter. Yet beneath the polished exterior, cracks were beginning to form. Tonight, like so many other nights, he stayed late, escaping the suffocating silence of his sprawling home. It wasn't the house itself that felt oppressive. It was the hollow emptiness of his personal life. His marriage to Eleanor, once filled with laughter and passion, had turned into little more than a business partnership. She had stopped waiting up for him years ago. Their shared goal of building a family had crumbled after countless failed attempts. Eleanor had always borne their struggle with dignity, but Matthew had buried himself in work, hiding from the pain of failure. The strain between them had become palpable, a tension that lingered in every shared glance, every hollow exchange. "Mr. Carter," his assistant's voice crackled over the intercom, "your wife is here to see you." Matthew frowned, his heart skipping a beat. Eleanor rarely visited him at work. "Send her in," he replied, trying to sound composed. The door opened, and Eleanor stepped in, a vision of understated elegance. Her simple navy dress clung to her slim frame, and her hair, though pinned back neatly, carried streaks of gray that hadn't been there a year ago. She smiled faintly, but the warmth that had once defined her gaze was missing. "Eleanor," Matthew greeted her, forcing a smile. "What brings you here?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment before sitting down in one of the plush chairs opposite his desk. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Matthew sat across from her, his brow furrowing. "Of course," he said, masking his unease. "What's on your mind?" Eleanor's eyes flickered to the photograph on his desk, a candid picture of the two of them taken years ago, during happier times. "I saw Dr. Lawrence today," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The treatments, they haven't worked." Matthew stiffened. Though he had anticipated this, hearing it aloud still felt like a punch to the gut. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I see," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you even care anymore, Matthew? Or have you buried yourself so deep in your work that nothing else matters?" The words stung, but Matthew kept his expression impassive. "Of course I care," he replied, though even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. Eleanor shook her head, her lips curving into a sad smile. "I don't know if you do," she said softly. "We've built this life together, this empire, but somewhere along the way we lost each other." Matthew wanted to protest, to reassure her, but the truth was undeniable. He had become a stranger to his own wife, and she had become a stranger to him. Before he could formulate a response, a soft knock at the door interrupted them. "Come in," Matthew called, relieved by the distraction. The door opened, and Amara stepped inside. She was one of the newer household staff members, a quiet, diligent woman who had quickly earned Eleanor's trust. Tonight, however, her usual composure was absent. Her dark eyes were rimmed with red, and her hands trembled as she clutched her apron. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice shaking. "But I need to speak with you, Mr. Carter. It's urgent." Eleanor stood, smoothing her dress. "I'll leave you to it," she said, her tone cool but resigned. "We can finish this conversation later." As Eleanor left, Matthew turned his attention to Amara. "What is it?" he asked, his irritation evident. Amara took a shaky breath, her gaze darting nervously around the room. I don't know how to say this, but I don't have a choice." Her voice cracked, and she looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "Mr. Carter, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Matthew's heart pounded as he stared at her, his mind racing. Their brief affair had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment during a moment of weakness. He had convinced himself that it was behind him, a secret buried so deep it could never resurface. But now, with those 3 words, his carefully constructed world began to unravel. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Amara nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, sir, I'm sure." Matthew turned away, running a hand through his hair. His thoughts spiraled. Eleanor, his reputation, his empire. He had spent his entire life cultivating an image of perfection, of control. This could destroy everything. "You can't stay here," he said finally, his tone cold and detached. I'll make arrangements for you. Financial arrangements. But you need to leave." Amara stared at him, disbelief and heartbreak etched across her face. "Leave?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "You're asking me to leave?" "Yes," Matthew said firmly. "It's for the best, for everyone." He opened the safe behind his desk, pulling out an envelope stuffed with cash. "This should be more than enough to get you started," he said, thrusting it toward her. "Take it and go. Tonight." Amara hesitated, her hand hovering over the envelope. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, Matthew saw the depth of her pain. But she didn't argue. With trembling hands, she took the envelope and clutched it to her chest. "Goodbye, Mr. Carter," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. As she turned to leave, Matthew felt an ache in his chest, a pang of guilt, of regret. But he buried it quickly, just as he had buried every other emotion that threatened to disrupt his meticulously ordered life. He watched as the door closed behind her, and then he sank into his chair, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Outside, the night was still and quiet, the city's hum muted by the thick glass of Matthew's office windows. But within him, a storm raged, a storm that would not abate. A new dawn. Amara stood at the bus station as the first light of dawn spilled over the horizon. She clutched a small suitcase in one hand, the envelope of money Matthew had given her in the other. Her cheeks were stained with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away, but her eyes burned with a newfound determination. The decision to leave wasn't easy, but staying would have been worse. She had worked in the Carter household for less than a year, yet it had felt like a lifetime. She had entered that world with nothing but hope for a better future and had been cast out with nothing but heartbreak. But now, as she touched her still flat stomach, she knew she wasn't leaving alone. "This is for us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I promise, no matter what, I'll give you the life you deserve." The bus's brakes hissed as it pulled into the station, its worn exterior a stark contrast to the pristine luxury of the Carter mansion. Amara stepped aboard and handed the driver her ticket, taking a seat near the window. As the bus pulled away, she kept her gaze fixed on the city skyline, the towering buildings that had once felt like symbols of opportunity now looming like prison walls. She didn't look back at the Carter estate. She couldn't bear to. Her destination was a city she had never been to, chosen at random from the bus schedule. The money Matthew had given her would last a few months if she was frugal. After that, she'd have to fend for herself, but she wasn't afraid. Amara had faced hardship before, and she would face it again if it meant protecting her child. The first few weeks in the new city were brutal. Amara rented a small room in a boarding house, using the rest of the money to buy essentials. Each day was a struggle to find work. Most places turned her away, their polite smiles masking thinly veiled judgment. But she refused to give up. For her unborn child, she would do whatever it took. Finally, after weeks of searching, she landed a job as a waitress at a small diner. The pay was meager, and the hours were long, but it was a start. She worked tirelessly, ignoring the aches in her feet and the whispers of her coworkers who speculated about her growing belly. At night, she studied on an old second-hand laptop she had purchased, determined to build a future beyond the diner. She had always dreamed of becoming a lawyer, and now, with nothing left to lose, she decided to chase that dream. Months turned into years. Amara's life was a blur of late-night studying, early morning shifts, and countless sacrifices. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy she named Noah, a name that symbolized strength and renewal. Holding him for the first time, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. "It's you and me now," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We'll make it through, I promise." As Noah grew, so did Amara's resolve. She worked harder than ever, earning her GED and enrolling in night classes at a community college. Every milestone in Noah's life fueled her determination. His first steps, his first words, they were all reminders of what she was fighting for. She wanted to give him a life free from the shadows of the past, a life filled with love and opportunity. By the time Noah was 5, Amara had earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. She juggled her studies with her role as a single mother, often sacrificing sleep to prepare for exams or finish assignments. Noah, ever perceptive, would watch her with wide eyes as she pored over textbooks late into the night. "Why do you work so hard, Mommy?" he asked one evening, his small hands tugging at her sleeve. Amara smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "Because I want to make sure you have everything you need," she said softly. "I want you to be proud of me." "I am proud of you," Noah replied, his voice filled with a sincerity that brought tears to her eyes. Those words became her anchor. No matter how difficult things got, she held on to them, drawing strength from her son's unwavering belief in her. By the time Noah was 13, Amara had transformed her life. She had graduated at the top of her class and built a thriving career as a lawyer. She was no longer the scared young woman who had been cast out with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. She was Amara Lawson, respected attorney, loving mother, and a force to be reckoned with. But despite all her accomplishments, there was one thing she couldn't ignore: Noah's questions about his father. He had always been curious, but as he grew older, his questions became more pointed. "Why don't I have a dad?" he asked one evening as they sat at the dinner table. Amara froze, her fork hovering midair. She had known this day would come, but she still wasn't prepared. Setting her fork down, she took a deep breath and met her son's gaze. "You do have a dad," she said carefully, "but it's complicated." Noah frowned. "Complicated how?" Amara hesitated, choosing her words with care. "Your father and I, we come from very different worlds. When I told him I was pregnant, he didn't handle it well." Noah's eyes widened. "He didn't want me." "It's not that simple," Amara said quickly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Your father made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you aren't loved. You are my everything, Noah, and I've always done my best to make sure you never felt like you were missing out." Noah nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't satisfied. She knew then that she couldn't keep the truth from him forever. He deserved to know where he came from, and Matthew Carter needed to face the consequences of his actions. Amara's decision to confront Matthew wasn't easy, but it was necessary. She couldn't ignore the opportunity Noah had been given. A chance to attend Westbrook Academy, one of the most prestigious schools in the country. It was everything she had ever wanted for him. But the tuition was astronomical. Even with her successful career, she couldn't cover the cost on her own. She spent weeks preparing for the meeting, gathering every piece of evidence she could find to prove Noah's parentage. She wasn't doing this for herself. She didn't need Matthew's money or approval. This was about Noah, about giving him the future he deserved. When the day finally came, Amara stood at the gates of the Carter estate, her heart pounding in her chest. Noah stood beside her, his hand in hers, his expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. Noah nodded. "I'm ready." As they walked up the long driveway, Amara couldn't help but think about the last time she had been here. She had left with nothing but heartbreak and a promise to herself. Now she was returning with her head held high, ready to reclaim what had been taken from her. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her son. A new dawn. The walk up the driveway felt like stepping into another life. The sprawling Carter estate was just as imposing as Amara remembered. Tall iron gates, manicured hedges, and the sprawling mansion standing proudly like a monument to excess. It was a place that once symbolized her hopes for a better future, but had turned into a memory of rejection and betrayal. Noah, unaware of the depth of his mother's emotions, glanced around with wide-eyed curiosity. "This place is huge," he whispered, his voice tinged with awe. "Did you really work here, Mom?" Amara nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "Yes, I did," she said softly, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "A long time ago." They reached the front steps, and Amara hesitated for a moment before pressing the doorbell. The chime echoed loudly, cutting through the quiet of the estate. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The door opened, and a middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform greeted them. Her expression was polite but guarded. "May I help you?" "Yes," Amara said, her voice firm. "My name is Amara Lawson. I need to speak with Matthew Carter. It's urgent." The woman's eyes flickered with recognition at Amara's name, but she quickly masked it with professional composure. "Mr. Carter is a very busy man. Do you have an appointment?" "No," Amara replied, standing her ground. "But he'll want to see me. Please tell him it's about an important matter." The woman hesitated, clearly torn, before finally nodding. "Wait here, please." As the door closed, Amara exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. Noah looked up at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "Are you okay, Mom?" She smiled down at him, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Everything is going to be okay." Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Just as Amara began to wonder if they'd been dismissed, the door opened again. The same woman gestured for them to enter. "Mr. Carter will see you in his office." Amara nodded her thanks, guiding Noah inside. The interior was as opulent as she remembered. Marble floors, grand chandeliers, and an air of wealth so thick it was almost suffocating. The house hadn't changed, but Amara had. She walked with her head held high, her heels clicking against the polished floors as she followed the woman. When they reached the office door, the woman stepped aside. "He's waiting for you." Amara took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Matthew Carter sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his fingers steepled as he stared out the window. His back was to the door, but he stiffened at the sound of it opening. Slowly, he turned, and when his eyes met Amara's, they widened in shock. "Amara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here?" Amara didn't answer immediately. She stepped inside, her posture radiating confidence. Noah followed close behind, his gaze flickering between his mother and the man he didn't yet know was his father. "Hello, Matthew," Amara said, her tone cool but steady. "It's been a long time." Matthew rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were trying to process her sudden appearance. "It has," he said carefully. His eyes darted to Noah, and confusion clouded his features. "And who is this?" Amara placed a protective hand on Noah's shoulder. "This," she said softly, "is Noah. My son. Our son." The words hit Matthew like a thunderclap. He stumbled back slightly, his hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. "Our son," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. His eyes moved to Noah, scanning the boy's features, and the resemblance was undeniable. The shape of his jaw, the curve of his nose, the piercing blue eyes, it was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. "Yes, your son," Amara said firmly. "He's 13 years old now. Bright, talented, and full of potential. He's everything I promised myself he would be. Matthew's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of her revelation left him momentarily speechless. Why? He finally managed to say, his voice barely audible. Why now? Amara's expression hardened. Because Noah deserves to know the truth, and because he's been accepted into Westbrook Academy. Matthew blinked, his confusion deepening. Westbrook. That's one of the most prestigious schools in the country. It is, Amara said, her tone cool. But the tuition is steep, and even with my success, it's more than I can manage alone. I'm here because it's time you stepped up, Matthew. Time you took responsibility for the son you abandoned. Matthew flinched at her words, guilt flashing across his face. Amara. No, she interrupted, her voice firm. You don't get to make excuses. Not anymore. I've given Noah everything I could. I've sacrificed, struggled, and worked harder than you'll ever know to give him the life he deserves. But now he has an opportunity that could change his future, and I won't let your pride or fear get in the way. Noah, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. Is it true? He asked, his voice trembling. Are you my dad? Matthew's heart broke at the vulnerability in the boy's voice. He stared at Noah, the resemblance undeniable, and felt a surge of emotions, guilt, regret, and a flicker of pride. Yes, he said finally, his voice cracking. Yes, I'm your father. Noah's eyes widened, and he took a step back, processing the revelation. Amara placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. I don't need your money, Matthew, she said, her voice quieter now. But Noah deserves your support, not just financially. He deserves to know where he came from. He deserves to know you. Matthew swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had spent years burying his guilt, convincing himself that cutting ties with Amara had been the right decision. But now, faced with the living, breathing evidence of his actions, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I'll help, he said finally, his voice trembling. With Westbrook, with whatever he needs. Amara nodded, her expression unreadable. Good, because this isn't about you or me, Matthew. It's about Noah. And he deserves the best. Matthew looked at his son, his heart heavy with regret. Noah, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. I know I've made mistakes, and I know I've hurt your mother, but I want to get to know you, if you'll let me. Noah hesitated, his gaze flickering to Amara for reassurance. She nodded gently, and he turned back to Matthew. Okay, he said quietly. We can try. As they left the office, Amara felt a mix of emotions, relief, anxiety, and a flicker of hope. She had fought for her son's future, and now, for better or worse, Matthew Carter would be part of it. It was the start of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, but also possibility. And for the first time in years, Amara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could turn out all right. A father's reckoning. Matthew Carter sat alone in his study long after Amara and Noah had left. The weight of the encounter pressed down on him like a leaden fog, suffocating in its intensity. He swirled a glass of bourbon in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the desk lamp. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, but inside Matthew's mind, chaos reigned. 13 years. For 13 years, he had convinced himself that he had done the right thing by cutting ties with Amara. He had told himself it was better for everyone. Better for Eleanor, better for his reputation, better for the baby he had refused to acknowledge. Yet now, faced with the undeniable truth of his son's existence, those justifications felt hollow and cowardly. Noah. The boy's name lingered in his mind, accompanied by the image of his face. The resemblance had been like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of the past he had tried so desperately to bury. He saw himself in Noah's sharp blue eyes, the strong line of his jaw, even in the way the boy carried himself, with confidence and determination that Matthew recognized all too well. But it wasn't just the resemblance that haunted him. It was Noah's vulnerability, the way his voice had trembled when he asked if Matthew was his father. The boy deserved answers, yet all Matthew could offer was shame and regret. He had abandoned his son, and no amount of wealth or power could change that fact. The next morning, Matthew awoke with a pounding headache and a deep sense of unease. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the family portrait that hung on the opposite wall. It was a relic from a time when he and Eleanor still smiled at each other, still shared dreams of building a family. But those dreams had turned to ashes long ago, leaving behind a fragile marriage held together by appearances and routine. Eleanor deserved to know the truth. That much was clear. But how could he tell her? How could he shatter the delicate peace they had managed to maintain? Matthew ran a hand through his graying hair, his thoughts tangled in a web of fear and indecision. "Good morning." Eleanor's voice broke through his reverie. She stood in the doorway, dressed impeccably as always, her expression cool but curious. "You're up early." Matthew forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Couldn't sleep," he said, standing and adjusting his tie. "Busy day ahead." Eleanor arched a brow, her gaze sharp and probing. "Busy with what? You've been distracted lately." Matthew hesitated, his heart pounding. He opened his mouth to speak, but quickly thought better of it. "Just some issues at work," he said, his voice steady despite the guilt gnawing at him. "Nothing to worry about." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't press further. "Well, don't work too hard," she said, her tone clipped as she turned and walked away. Matthew watched her go, his chest tightening. He knew he was running out of time to come clean. Secrets like this didn't stay buried forever. Later that day, Matthew found himself sitting across from his lawyer, Jonathan Parker, in a sleek conference room downtown. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes of legal texts, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and freshly brewed coffee. "So," Jonathan said, leaning back in his chair, "what's this about, Matthew? You sounded agitated on the phone." Matthew sighed, rubbing his temples. "I need your advice," he said, his voice low. "It's a personal matter." Jonathan raised a brow, his expression skeptical. "Personal? You usually keep those out of the office." "This is different," Matthew said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's about a child. My child." Jonathan's brows shot up in surprise, but he quickly composed himself. "Go on." Matthew explained everything. The affair, Amara's return, Noah's existence. As he spoke, Jonathan listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Matthew finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Jonathan leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Well," he said carefully, "you've certainly gotten yourself into a mess." "Tell me something I don't know," Matthew snapped, his frustration bubbling over. Jonathan held up a hand, his tone remaining calm. "Let's focus on what's next. First, you need to confirm paternity. Amara seems sincere, but you can't take any chances." "I don't need a test," Matthew said, his voice firm. "The boy's mine. I can see it." "Be that as it may," Jonathan replied, "a paternity test will protect you legally. Once that's done, you need to decide how involved you want to be in his life. Financially, emotionally. This isn't just about writing a check, Matthew. It's about commitment." Matthew leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, protecting my reputation. What happens if this gets out? What happens to Eleanor?" Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "You can't control everything, Matthew. Sometimes, doing the right thing means taking a hit. But if you keep running from this, it'll only get worse." Matthew nodded slowly, the weight of Jonathan's words sinking in. He had spent his life avoiding risk, avoiding pain. But now, there was no avoiding the truth. Noah was his son, and it was time to face that reality. A week later, Matthew sat in a quiet cafe, waiting for Amara and Noah to arrive. The place was small and unassuming, a far cry from the opulence Matthew was accustomed to. Yet it felt right, neutral ground where they could have a conversation without the weight of the Carter estate looming over them. When the door opened and Amara stepped inside, Matthew felt a jolt of nervous energy. She was as composed as ever, her sharp suit and confident stride a testament to the life she had built for herself. Noah followed close behind, his wide eyes taking in the cozy interior. "Thank you for meeting me," Matthew said as they approached his table. He stood, extending a hand to Noah, who shook it hesitantly. "Of course," Amara replied, her tone polite but guarded. "Noah has some questions, and I think it's time he got some answers." They sat down, and Matthew took a deep breath. "Noah," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know I haven't been there for you, and I know I can't make up for lost time. But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You're an incredible young man, and I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." Noah looked at him, his expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "Why did you leave?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you want me?" Matthew's heart broke at the question, and he struggled to find the right words. "I was a coward," he admitted finally. "I was scared of what people would think, scared of how it would change my life. But that was wrong, Noah. You deserve better than that." Noah nodded slowly, his eyes searching Matthew's face. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "But you have to try. You can't just say things and then disappear again." "I won't," Matthew promised, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust." As the meeting continued, Matthew felt a flicker of hope for the first time in years. It wouldn't be easy, but for Noah, and for himself, he was willing to try. Eleanor's truth. Eleanor Carter stood in her sunlit garden, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of roses, but even the serenity of the blooming flowers couldn't quiet the unease brewing within her. She had been married to Matthew for over 2 decades, and yet she felt like she didn't know him anymore. Lately, his absences had become more frequent, his demeanor more withdrawn. Something was wrong, and Eleanor's instincts, honed by years of reading between the lines in high society, screamed that her husband was hiding something. The faint crunch of gravel behind her pulled her from her thoughts. Turning, she saw Matthew walking toward her, his shoulders stiff, his expression unreadable. Eleanor placed her cup on the garden table and folded her arms, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You're home late again," she said, her voice steady but tinged with accusation. "What's going on, Matthew?" Matthew stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, he looked at her as though weighing the weight of the world, his lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Eleanor recognized that look. It was the same one he wore when he had to deliver bad news at his board meetings. "Eleanor," he began, his voice quieter than she expected. "There's something I need to tell you." The tension in the air thickened. Eleanor's heart began to race, but she refused to let it show. She stood straighter, bracing herself. "Go on," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm listening." Inside the mansion, they sat across from each other in the parlor, a room rarely used but filled with heirloom furniture and the weight of expectation. Eleanor watched her husband carefully, noting the way his hands fidgeted, a habit she hadn't seen in years. It was unnerving, to say the least. "Do you remember Amara?" Matthew asked, breaking the silence. The name hung in the air, unfamiliar to Eleanor at first. "The maid?" Eleanor asked, tilting her head. "She worked here years ago." "Why do you ask?" Matthew exhaled deeply, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "There's something I never told you," he admitted. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "Matthew, what is this about?" She had my child," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A son. His name is Noah. He's 13 years old now." For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. When they finally sank in, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You? What?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You had a child with one of our staff, and you've kept this from me for 13 years. Matthew stood as well, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Eleanor, I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Eleanor echoed, her tone incredulous. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You lied to me, Matthew. For years you lied." "I know," Matthew said, his voice cracking. "I know, and I'm sorry. I was selfish and weak, and I've regretted it every day since." Eleanor turned away from him, her hands gripping the back of her chair as she struggled to steady her breathing. Memories of their years together flashed through her mind, their shared dreams of starting a family, the painful silence after every failed treatment. And all the while, Matthew had been keeping this devastating secret. "Where is he?" she asked finally, her voice cold. "Where is this child of yours?" "His name is Noah," Matthew said softly. "Amara brought him to see me. He's a bright, talented boy, Eleanor. And he's mine." The raw emotion in Matthew's voice caught Eleanor off guard. She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want me to say, Matthew? That I forgive you? That I welcome this boy into our lives with open arms?" "I don't expect forgiveness," Matthew said, his tone earnest. "But he's not just some boy, Eleanor. He's my son. I've already failed him once. I can't do it again." The rest of the day passed in a haze for Eleanor. She wandered the mansion aimlessly, replaying Matthew's confession over and over in her mind. She thought of Amara, a young woman she had trusted, never suspecting the betrayal that had taken place under her roof. She thought of Noah, a boy she had never met, but who now loomed large in her life. By evening, Eleanor found herself in her art studio, a space she rarely used anymore. She picked up a brush and began to paint, her strokes wild and chaotic. She had always turned to art in times of turmoil, using the canvas as an outlet for emotions she couldn't put into words. As the painting took shape, Eleanor's mind began to clear. Anger still simmered beneath the surface, but it was joined by something else, a deep, aching sadness. For years, she and Matthew had been drifting apart, their marriage reduced to a fragile facade. Perhaps this revelation was the final blow, or perhaps it was an opportunity to confront the truths they had been avoiding for so long. The next morning, Eleanor made a decision. She found Matthew in his study, sitting at his desk with his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression weary. "I want to meet him," she said, her voice steady. "Noah." Matthew's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure?" "No," Eleanor admitted. "But this isn't just about you or me. It's about him. He didn't ask to be born into this mess, and he deserves better than being ignored." Matthew nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know this isn't easy." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's not. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life rarely is." A week later, Eleanor found herself sitting across from Noah and Amara in a quiet cafe. Matthew sat beside her, his posture tense but his expression hopeful. Eleanor studied the boy carefully, noting the striking resemblance to her husband. But there was something else in Noah's eyes, an intelligence and warmth that softened the sharp edges of her resentment. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Carter," Noah said politely, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "And you, Noah," Eleanor replied, offering a small smile. She turned to Amara, her gaze unreadable. "It seems we have a lot to discuss." Amara nodded, her expression calm but wary. "Yes, we do." As the conversation unfolded, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of emotions. She couldn't deny the pain of Matthew's betrayal, but she also couldn't ignore the undeniable bond between him and Noah. For the first time in years, she saw a spark of life in her husband's eyes, a spark that had been missing for far too long. By the end of the meeting, Eleanor felt a tentative sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Together, they would have to navigate the messy, complicated road ahead. And perhaps in doing so, they might find a way to heal the fractures that had long divided them. Eleanor's truth. The cafe's ambient hum filled the space as Eleanor sipped her tea, her eyes shifting between Noah and Amara. Matthew sat beside her, visibly uncomfortable, but trying to appear composed. Eleanor had always been adept at reading people, and in this moment, it was clear that her husband was grappling with a lifetime's worth of guilt and regret. But Eleanor wasn't ready to focus on Matthew. Her attention was on the boy who had reshaped her world in a single afternoon. So, Eleanor began, her voice calm but deliberate. "Noah, your mother tells me you've been accepted into Westbrook Academy. That's an impressive achievement." Noah nodded, his dark eyes lighting up with excitement. "Yes, ma'am. I've wanted to go there for as long as I can remember. Their law program is incredible, and I want to be a lawyer someday, like my mom." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Amara, who sat poised and composed, her expression a mix of pride and guardedness. "You've done well raising him," Eleanor said, her voice free of malice, but heavy with truth. "I can see he's a remarkable young man." Amara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the compliment without gloating. "Thank you," she replied. "I've done my best." Eleanor placed her teacup down carefully, the faint clink of porcelain against the saucer punctuating her next words. "And now you're here because you believe Matthew should contribute, not just financially, but as a father." Noah shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Amara reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't easy for any of us," Amara said softly, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "But yes, I believe Noah deserves to know his father. He deserves to know where he comes from." Eleanor studied Amara for a long moment, her mind turning over the words. There was no malice in the other woman's tone, no hidden agenda. Amara was simply a mother fighting for her son, and Eleanor couldn't falter for that. As they left the cafe, Eleanor felt the weight of the situation settle more heavily on her shoulders. Noah walked beside Amara, their bond evident in every interaction. Matthew lingered a step behind, his expression a mix of longing and unease. Eleanor's heart ached at the sight. Despite everything, she could see how much Matthew wanted to connect with his son. When they reached the car, Eleanor paused, turning to Noah. "Noah," she said gently, "I'd like you to come visit us, spend some time at the house. Would that be all right with you?" Noah's eyes widened in surprise. He glanced at Amara, who gave him a small nod. "I'd like that," he said finally, his voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "Good," Eleanor said with a faint smile. "We'll arrange something soon." As they drove back to the estate, Eleanor's mind raced. She had extended the invitation on impulse, but now that the words were out, she couldn't take them back. She wasn't sure how she felt about Noah being in their home, about the disruption his presence would inevitably bring. But she knew it was the right thing to do, for him, for Matthew, and perhaps even for herself. The following weekend, Noah arrived at the Carter estate for the first time. Eleanor greeted him at the door, her usual composed demeanor softened slightly. "Welcome," she said warmly, gesturing for him to come inside. "I'll give you a tour." As they walked through the grand halls, Eleanor couldn't help but notice the way Noah's eyes widened at the sheer scale of the house. It was clear he wasn't accustomed to such extravagance, and Eleanor found herself wondering how he felt about stepping into a world so different from his own. "This is the library," Eleanor said as they entered a room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. "Matthew spends most of his time here when he's not working." Noah ran his fingers along the spines of the books, his gaze lingering on the titles. "It's incredible," he said softly. "I've never seen so many books in one place." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You're welcome to borrow anything you like," she said. "Knowledge should be shared, not hoarded." As they continued the tour, Eleanor found herself unexpectedly charmed by Noah's curiosity and intelligence. He asked thoughtful questions about the art and architecture, his youthful enthusiasm reminding her of a time when she and Matthew had been filled with similar wonder. Later that evening, the family gathered for dinner in the formal dining room. The atmosphere was tense at first, with Matthew and Noah exchanging cautious glances across the table. But as the meal progressed, the barriers began to break down. "So, Noah," Matthew said, his voice tentative, "what are you most excited about at Westbrook?" Noah hesitated, clearly unused to the attention, but Amare gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm really looking forward to the debate team," he said finally. "I've always loved arguing my case and proving my points." Matthew chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Sounds like you've inherited that from me," he said. "I've been told I'm quite persuasive." Eleanor watched the exchange carefully, her emotions conflicting. She could see the connection forming between father and son. And while it was heartening, it also stirred a deep sadness within her. This was a bond she could never share with Matthew, a bond built on the legacy of a child she could never give him. After dinner, Eleanor retreated to the garden, needing space to process her emotions. She stood beneath the stars, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Footsteps approached, and she turned to see Matthew standing behind her. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low. "Thank you for giving Noah a chance, for giving me a chance." Eleanor sighed, crossing her arms as she looked out over the darkened grounds. "This isn't easy for me, Matthew," she admitted, "but I'm trying. For his sake." "I know," Matthew said, stepping closer, "and I'll never stop being grateful." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression serious. "Don't make me regret this, Matthew. If you let that boy down, if you hurt him the way you've hurt me, there will be no forgiveness." Matthew nodded, his eyes filled with a sincerity Eleanor hadn't seen in years. "I won't," he promised. "I swear, I won't." As he walked away, Eleanor remained in the garden, her thoughts heavy. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: her life, and her marriage, would never be the same again. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. Noah's place. The golden rays of the early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Carter Estates library, bathing the room in a warm glow. Noah sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, a thick leather-bound book resting in his lap. The room was silent except for the occasional rustle of pages and the distant hum of the groundskeepers mowing the lawn. He had been at the estate for 3 days now, and though he tried to remain composed, the grandeur of it all was overwhelming. Every corner of the house seemed to exude power and wealth, a stark contrast to the modest apartment he shared with his mother. Yet despite its opulence, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing here, something intangible but deeply significant. "Good morning," came a voice from the doorway. Noah looked up to see Eleanor standing there, a cup of coffee in hand. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in tailored trousers and a silk blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat chignon. She stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished wooden floor. "Good morning," Noah replied, setting the book aside. Eleanor studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gestured to the chair opposite him. "May I?" Noah nodded. Of course. She sat down gracefully, crossing her legs and taking a sip of her coffee. "You've made yourself comfortable, I see." Noah smiled faintly. "I love this room. There's so much to explore." "It was one of my favorite places when I first moved in," Eleanor said, her tone softening. "Books have a way of making even the grandest house feel human." Noah nodded, his gaze drifting back to the shelves. "Do you think I'll ever fit in here?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. Eleanor was taken aback by his honesty. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "That depends," she said finally. "Fitting in isn't about the place. It's about the people. And sometimes, it takes time for people to find their place in a family." Noah looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers for any hint of insincerity. "Do you think I'll be able to find my place here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor hesitated, then leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "I think you already have," she said. "You just don't realize it yet." Matthew entered the room an hour later, finding Noah engrossed in another book. He paused in the doorway, watching his son with a mix of pride and hesitation. This was his chance, a chance to connect with the boy who shared his blood, his name, and so much more. "Noah," Matthew said, his voice breaking the silence. "Do you have a minute?" Noah looked up, his expression wary but curious. "Sure." Matthew gestured to the door. "There's something I want to show you. Come with me." Curiosity piqued, Noah followed his father through the sprawling mansion and out onto the grounds. They walked in silence, the cool morning air refreshing against their skin. Matthew led him to a small guest house tucked away in a quiet corner of the estate. It was a modest structure compared to the main house, with ivy climbing its brick walls, and a charming wooden door. "This," Matthew said, pushing the door open, "was my retreat when I was your age. I'd come here to escape the chaos of the house, to think, to dream." Noah stepped inside, his eyes widening as he took in the room. It was cozy and well-kept, with a desk, a small bed, and shelves lined with old books and trophies. A dusty chessboard sat on a table in the corner, the pieces mid-game as if frozen in time. "I used to spend hours here," Matthew continued, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Sometimes I'd read. Sometimes I'd just sit and stare out the window, wondering what the future would hold." Noah ran his fingers along the edge of the desk, his mind racing. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, looking up at his father. Matthew hesitated, then placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "Because I want you to know that you have a place here," he said. "Not just in this house, but in my life. I want you to feel like this is your home too." Noah swallowed hard, emotion welling up in his chest. He wanted to believe his father's words, to trust that they were more than just empty promises. But trust didn't come easily, not after 13 years of silence. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice quiet. "It means a lot." Matthew nodded, sensing the boy's apprehension. He knew it would take time to earn Noah's trust, but he was determined to do whatever it took. Later that evening, the family gathered in the sitting room for a game of chess. It was Eleanor's idea, a subtle attempt to bring everyone together. Amara had left earlier that day, giving Noah the space to bond with his father and Eleanor without her presence complicating matters. "Do you play?" Matthew asked as he set up the board. "A little," Noah admitted, sitting across from him. "My mom taught me." "Then let's see what you've got," Matthew said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The game began, and for the first time in days, the tension in the room seemed to ease. Noah played with surprising skill, his moves thoughtful and deliberate. Matthew countered with equal precision, but he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride at his son's intelligence and strategic thinking. "You're good," Matthew said after a particularly clever move by Noah. "Really good." Noah shrugged, but his cheeks flushed with pride. "Mom always says chess is about thinking ahead, planning your next move." "Smart woman," Eleanor said, sipping her wine as she watched from the sidelines. "She's raised a remarkable son." Noah glanced at her, his expression softening. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter." "Eleanor," she corrected gently. "You can call me Eleanor." Noah smiled, and for the first time, it felt genuine. "Thank you, Eleanor." As the evening wore on, laughter and conversation replaced the awkward silences that had defined the past few days. Eleanor found herself watching Matthew and Noah with a mix of emotions. She could see the bond forming between them, and while it stirred a pang of jealousy, of longing for what she could never have, it also brought a sense of peace. After the game ended, Noah excused himself to call Amara and tell her about his day. Eleanor lingered in the sitting room, pouring herself another glass of wine as Matthew leaned back in his chair, a rare look of contentment on his face. "He's an incredible kid," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "He is," Eleanor agreed, swirling her wine in the glass. "And he deserves the world." Matthew nodded, his expression growing serious. "I just hope I can give him what he needs. I've already missed so much." Eleanor looked at him, her gaze softening. "You can't change the past, Matthew, but you can be there for him now. That's what matters." As they sat together in the quiet room, the weight of the past seemed to lift just slightly. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps they could find a way to make this fractured family whole. A new legacy. The day dawned with the crisp air of autumn, the golden leaves of the trees scattered across the expansive Carter estate. Noah stood on the balcony of the guest house, now dubbed his space, gazing at the rolling grounds below. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, revelations, and adjustments, but he felt something new stirring within him, possibility. Amara arrived later that morning, her heels clicking against the stone pathway as she approached the main house. Matthew met her at the door, his expression a mix of gratitude and apprehension. He had insisted on hosting a formal brunch for everyone, a symbolic gesture to mark the start of a new chapter. Amara had agreed, though she remained wary of what the day might bring. Inside, Eleanor moved through the dining room with quiet efficiency, arranging flowers and ensuring everything was perfect. She had insisted on handling the details herself, refusing help from the staff. For her, this gathering was about more than appearances. It was about creating an environment where they could all find common ground, however fragile it might be. The table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, the centerpiece a cascade of autumn blooms. Noah sat between Amara and Matthew, his posture tense, but his face alight with curiosity. Eleanor took her place at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over the group. "Thank you all for being here," Eleanor began, her voice calm but firm. "I know this situation is unconventional, but I believe it's important for us to come together, not just for Noah, but for all of us." Amara nodded, her expression softening. "I agree. Noah deserves a family, however complicated the family might be." Matthew glanced at Eleanor, his gratitude evident. He knew she didn't have to do this, didn't have to extend herself in such a vulnerable way. But her grace in the face of everything humbled him. Noah, sensing the weight of the moment, cleared his throat. I want to thank everyone," he said, his voice steady but emotional, "for giving me a chance to be part of this. I know it's not easy, and I'm still figuring things out, but it means a lot." Eleanor reached over, placing a hand on his. "You're not just a part of this, Noah. You're the heart of it." After brunch, the group moved to the garden. Matthew led Noah to a shaded bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. For a moment, they sat in silence, the rustle of leaves the only sound. "I want to tell you something," Matthew said finally, his tone uncharacteristically soft. "When I was your age, I didn't have much of a relationship with my father. He was always busy, always too preoccupied with work. I swore I'd never be like him. But here we are." Noah looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "You're trying now," he said simply. "That matters." Matthew felt a lump rise in his throat. "I am. And I know I have a lot to make up for. But I want you to know that I'm here. For anything you need. Always." Noah nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. I think I want to spend more time here. Not just for me, but to figure out how we fit together. I want to know you better." Matthew's heart swelled with emotion, but he kept his voice steady. "I'd like that. More than you know." Meanwhile, Eleanor and Amara strolled through the rose garden, the tension between them slowly giving way to something more measured. Eleanor stopped near a particularly vibrant bush, her fingers brushing the petals. "You've raised an exceptional son," she said without preamble, her voice thoughtful. "I see so much of you in him." Amara smiled faintly. "And so much of Matthew," she replied. "He's a mix of both of us, for better or worse." Eleanor turned to her, her gaze piercing. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive Matthew for what he did, but I can't deny that Noah is a gift, and I won't let my resentment stand in the way of what's best for him." Amara studied Eleanor for a moment, then nodded. "That's all I want, for Noah to have the opportunities he deserves, and for him to know where he comes from." Eleanor's lips quirked into a small smile. "Well, you've certainly ensured that." As the day wore on, the group reconvened in the library. Noah, emboldened by the warmth of the day's events, began asking questions about the family's history. Matthew and Eleanor took turns sharing stories, some humorous, others poignant. Amara chimed in occasionally, her insights adding depth to the conversation. For the first time, laughter echoed through the room, a sound that felt both foreign and welcome. The walls that had once seemed so imposing now felt a little less so, as if the house itself were adjusting to this new dynamic. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Noah sat alone on the balcony of the guest house. The events of the day swirled in his mind, a kaleidoscope of emotions and revelations. He had arrived at the estate uncertain of his place, but now he felt a tentative sense of belonging. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Matthew stepped inside, his expression tentative. "I just wanted to say good night," he said, "and to tell you how proud I am of you." Noah smiled, the words filling a space in his heart he hadn't realized was empty. "Thanks, Dad." The simple word, "Dad," hit Matthew like a tidal wave. He blinked back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, and nodded. "Good night, son." As Matthew left, Noah leaned back against the chair, his gaze drifting to the stars. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it. He wasn't just a visitor in this world anymore. He was part of it. And together, they would build something new, something that could endure. A family.